Thank you so much for the lovely invitation to the whole group of CRAL people. It's so wonderful to be here, such an honor. Last time that I gave a talk in your seminar was back in the days when we had COVID and I was pregnant and I was secluded from life in so many ways. And now this is much, much nicer. When I heard about your title, the acceptability of narratives, what I immediately thought was context collapse. As I think that the context collapse, it's not just a social media phenomenon, but it also develops into what I call the narrative genre collapse. So that in today's narrative environments, although we have storytelling everywhere, it usually doesn't mean that we have very diverse ways of telling, but it usually means that we have very dominant forms of storytelling and also reception of stories. So what I try to convince you today about is that context collapse is also something that affects the literary field in a Bourdieuian sense. So this will be my topic today, and I will start with two examples that might seem to you very much far apart, but I will try to explain how they are actually related. So the first one you must be familiar with, oh no, click, and like this. So it's Vanessa Springora's Le Consentement. You're probably all familiar with the case. So Le Consentement is a memoir about Springora's role as one of the sexual abuse victims of Gabriel Massenet. And it's a book that was completely framed by the Me Too movement that arrived in France a bit later than maybe somewhere else. But it also included a lot of debate about literary value and what kind of social behavior, sexual behavior has been acceptable within the literary sphere in France. So there were quite a lot of interesting arguments. Maybe the most famous sentence from the book itself reads, "La littérature excuse elle tout." So does literature excuse everything? So back in the 60s, still in the 70s in France, many people within the cultural sphere would probably think that this might be the case. But then again, if you look at the reception, the international reception of Springora's book, it was really one of the most talked about European novels a couple of years ago, is that there is no critique whatsoever of the book as a piece of art. So it was all about hearing the voice of the victims, right? So one example would be the review published in The Guardian. But can a teenage girl have a magnificent love story with someone more than 3 times her age? This is the question at the heart of consent. Readers will not be in any doubt about the answer. So this was the framing of the reception of a literary work. So readers will have no doubt about the meaning of the book. And maybe you remember that Bernard Pivot, who seems to be a very prominent figure within the literary sphere, or at least he was back in the days, wrote in what used to be Twitter, "Dans les années, la littérature passait avant la morale. Aujourd'hui, la morale passe avant la littérature. Moralement, c'est un progrès." So it seems to me that he's saying that from the literary perspective, this is decline. So moralement, c'est un progrès, but artistically, maybe it's something else. I seem to read this kind of implication in the tweet. I might be wrong. And then another example from politics, since I want to do this cross-reading between fiction and politics. So maybe some of you know that at the moment in Finland, we have a very right-wing government. Sanna Marin lost, so everybody knows Sanna Marin, our former prime minister, the dancing prime minister. And so she lost, and now we have the right-wing government, and our Finnish Minister of Finances, Riikka Purra, found herself in a scandal pretty much at the early steps of the new government, because the social media activists were digging out old commentary section commentaries by Riikka, a pseudonym, and not a very smart pseudonym to come to think about it. So, for example, in 2008, she wrote in a blog comment section, "If I was given a gun, there would be bloodshed just in the local train." And this is our financial minister. And even in 2019, in her own blog, she wrote, "In our capital, unrecognizable black sacks walk around the streets, and you can tell that they are people only because they usually drag little people behind them. In a library in Espoo, one black sack is arranging books on the shelves. In the library, the very institution of our well-being and equality." And she has always also become famous of talking about the dangers of empathy in politics. So what she has said, for example, is empathy between people is crucial, but to let it guide political decision-making, it's dishonest to even to imagine such a thing. And here she's giving a press conference about the old social media commentaries. And here she's posing with scissors because they are now making radical cuts to social welfare. So she wants to play around by, being pictured with scissors. So that's the style of the Finns party in Finland. But a lot of the scandal was about context collapse, because the original commentary in 2008 was in the comment section of Scripta, which was the famous blog of the party leader of the Finns party, former party leader. And it was back in the days, it was a very niche thing. So she was talking to her peers and her own group, her own camp, and cut out from that context and full time, the content still travels and it finds new audiences, and the acceptability of the rhetoric is being repeatedly and over again evaluated. So this is context collapse, how social media scholars would usually understand it. So it was also a debate about context collapse and whether you can cut out commentary from its context and reframe it in yet another context. And this is what happens with social media all the time. But the argument that I am trying to promote here is that this also affects the literary sphere, and it's also related to how Springora's Le Consentement was framed with the Me Too movement. So the structure for the talk today is that first I will give you the state of the art of the research on context collapse, and then I will move on to describing how storytelling on social media usually looks like. People probably know, but from a theoretical perspective. And this also relates to what Sylvie has spoken to you about small stories. And then I will go on to introducing my theory of the viral exemplum and try to connect it with what I call the narrative context collapse. And then I will try to explain how context collapse might work within the literary field. And finally, I also present my theory of the transmedial authorial ethos that I've been working on lately. And finally, I will conclude by arguing that what I call the 21st century storytelling convergence affects the acceptability of narratives, the topic of this lecture series. So first, context collapse. The term was introduced by early social media scholars, and it goes back to Goffman's theories about our performance in different social situations, so how we are taking on different roles in different social situations. And to quote one of the key theories of context collapse, Dana Boyd, she writes that social media users are forced to grapple simultaneously with otherwise unrelated social contexts that are rooted in different norms and seemingly demand different social responses. So in short, sorry. In short, context collapse means that when you post something on, like we, the legacy people, post on Facebook, you have your relatives, your former schoolmates, your colleagues, and your boss among the same audience. So the social contexts are collapsing into one another. And many theorists agree on the fact that context collapse is precisely a function of social media affordances. So the platform affordances of social media, so what the social media afford the storyteller or the updater. So for example, sharing, liking, and so on. Those are the affordances that foster context collapse. And actually, there's I think a very useful list of social media affordances provided by Boyd and then Papagrisi and Gibson, and it includes persistence. So everybody warns their kids that if you write something on social media, it will be there forever. So that's persistence, and that also happened to Riikka, right? And replicability. So you can copy, for example, in TikTok, you can copy music pieces, you can copy dancing styles and so on. So a lot of the content is replicable in many senses. And then you have scalability. So things usually on social media, if something gets popular, it usually grows out of proportion because it's so scalable that it can always take new turns and it can be widened. So for example, how the Me Too worked, it was all about scalability. And searchability, so your posts can be searched. And this is also what happened to Riikka, our finance minister. And then shareability, of course. And then some theorists have paid attention to the fact that some users in some contexts are smarter and more strategic in their use of context collapse. So some users can perform like context collusion, so they actually want to the context to collide, or it can be involuntary when we can talk about collisions. And then some theories have introduced the temporal aspect to context collapse. So it's not just about having various and also unpredictable audiences for your social media content. It's also the temporal span, the long life of a social media update. So the temporal context changes too, and temporal context can be understood as colliding. So, and that's also one of the affordances that give this aura of universality to some social media content, like memes. They are like these gnomic statements from Balzac, where there's this universal truth presented in the present tense that lives on. So that's how memes work, and that's part of the temporal affordances of social media. And then the results or the consequences of context collapse for the acceptability of narratives is, of course, that there's always a risk of you being cancelled because your content ended up somewhere you didn't mean it to be ending up to. I can't read the... And then there's a possibility to increase in-group cohesion, like using irony, and like in classical theories of irony, you have two audiences. You have those who are your original audience, who get it, who get the joke, and then you have the audience who doesn't get the joke. So with context collapse, you can always play with this, and this is how populist politicians would usually do it. So they seem to have their own like-minded peers in mind as their original audience, and when the message leaks, it seems like it's an accident. It wasn't meant for you, or you're not understanding the context, and this can be done purposefully. So this is like purposeful context collapse. So in a way, leaking your own private communication that might be racist, for example. Yeah. Since I cannot read the lines, I don't even know what I have there. Oh yeah, and so finally, what I think that what is probably the most severe consequence of the narrative context collapse is that there arises this imperative of a transmedial, transgeneric, and transtemporal ethos. So you need to be consistent. You need to mean what you will mean in the future. You will need to be able to control all the possible present and future contexts. And to me, it has everything to do with narrative ethos, a topic that, for example, Lisbeth Kortals-Altes has been doing research on. So this is how context collapse relates to the question of narrative ethos, how to control the ethos attributions in the situation of context collapse. Okay, and then the typical characteristics of social media storytelling, as I think Sylvie must have said something about this when she was talking about small stories. But in a nutshell, social media storytelling is about your experience and your reaction to someone else's experience and reaction, usually. So social media storytelling is not about information. It's always, if it's about information, it's about your reaction to that information or your experience of a piece of information. And it's strongly affective, everybody knows that. So algorithms are fed by affective reactions, and it's always networked. And in my own research projects, we've been trying to show how the social media story logic foregrounds very prototypical experiential stories. These are the stories that first wave cognitive narratologists would call the narrative prototype. So the most tellable story on social media is a personal story of a transformative experience, and it usually involves some clear moral and relatable story world particulars. So for example, if you remember some of the early memes in the Ukrainian war, I'm not sure whether you came across this in France, but this was highly popular in Finland. There was a story about this babushka who knocked down a drone with a jar of cucumbers. So it's the perfect social media story because you have the underdog, the babushka, and the faceless war machine of Russia. You have the heroic nation of Ukrainian people and the babushka who preserves life in the can of conservatives. And she takes the can and crashes down the I'm doing something wrong.
No.
Yeah, but that's usually the case.
No, it's the your slide is cut, and then so I'm trying to correct it. But go on. Sorry to interrupt.
Down there. Yeah. So the babushka. So what you have there is this one particular very experiential story of an individual, and then you have the story was particular. So you have the jar of cucumbers and the drone. That is the metaphor of Russia, the faceless war machine, and the underdog story, a very strong master plot. So the point is that it's a shareable story because the moral positioning is so clear. You have no two questions about it. It's extremely easy to share, but there was also context collapse involved in the way that these Ukrainian memes spread, because there were also quite heavily nationalistic memes that were meant to the Ukrainian people, and then they also they were seen and circulated by the Western supporters. And of course, they had a lot of impact on how the Western states supported Ukraine and still support Ukraine. But at the same time, there's a risk of positioning Ukraine as this underdog, deserving poor in a situation that is highly complex, and it will take 20 years to sort out the political mess. So of course the memes were pretty simplistic, but they did their job on a short term. But in the long term, this kind of circulation of experiential memes that we cannot even verify usually, it also involves some political risks. But that's definitely the ideal social media story. It has a very strong story world in a very dense form, and the story world particulars and so on. Yet another thing with social media stories is that social media support countering stories, so counter narratives to the so-called master narratives. You may have a lot of master plots going on social media, so easily shareable underdog stories or from rags to riches and so on, recognizable story patterns. But oftentimes, it's still easier to tell a counter narrative to a master narrative. So for example, my colleague Matti Hyvärinen in Tampere has said that master narratives, as we often understand them, are not even really tellable. They are it's the ruling ideology of how moms are, for example, but telling a story about a different mom, a counter story, that's something that really goes viral on social media. So it can still be a master plot of the bad mom, but it's still a counter narrative. So this is something I've been writing about. So counter narratives can also become master plots in a way, and that's something that usually happens with the help of social media. So social media very strongly supports the gesture of countering, which then again feeds what Sylvia and others call the small stories or stance taking. It's easy to share the gesture, the narrative gesture of countering. So in addition to the fact that many of the viral stories, for example, on social media are highly prototypical in the cognitive sense, they have this one breach, story world breach, oftentimes a revelation, like a religious type of conversion even. But another aspect of social media storytelling is that it happens with very small gestures. So when you share another person's story, you can just simply say this, period. Because the content is so unproblematic that you can only share it with a very small gesture. So in addition to being highly moralistic and highly prototypical, it can be very economic social media storytelling. So it really builds on these very small gestures of stance taking, as Alexandra Dorka-Pulu has said, for example. And one of the troubling aspects of social media storytelling is definitely the fact that although you usually tell about one individual person's experience, it can be your own experience or a vicarious experience of someone else, an individual. The authorship is in nature collective. It's emergent, it's collective. You cannot reverse engineer authorship into certain individuals on social media. So if you have a moral outrage on social media, it can target individuals. It oftentimes targets individuals, but nobody is really responsible for the telling. One person is usually made responsible for something horrible happening, or one person is made a hero, but nobody is made responsible for the telling because the telling is emergent in nature. So it's like a flock of birds, and no one bird knows where you're going, not even the node influencer, who is the major sharer of the content. Not even her knows where the flock of birds is going. And that's why it's emergent. And this is why I think the acceptability of narratives need to be rethought in the context of social media, because nobody is responsible for the acceptability of the content. And then again, everybody is, right? And somehow, yeah, when you have a social media phenomenon around literature, you would usually have a victim and perpetrator. So clearly identified individuals in a literary work, for example, or in a literary case like with Springora and Masnet, you have this clear perpetrator and victim, but the act of retelling has no individual agents. And then, of course, quite clear is that all this together, put together, reinforces moral stances, and it also increases political polarization. There are wonderful research articles written by Francesca Polletta and others about the fact that actually individual stories of individual experience hardly ever change people's political attitudes, particularly if it's something that has to do with structural issues. So you can only cement your pre-existing political beliefs with individual stories, stories about individual experience. It's not as black and white as I present it to be, but the big picture is that usually they just cement your pre-existing political beliefs. Okay, and now one example of storytelling on social media, how it usually works. So there was this big controversy in Sweden in 2019 that had to do with the extreme right-wing party leader, Jimmie Åkesson. But Jimmie Åkesson wasn't present in any of the fragments of the story, but the controversy was called #Jimmie-moment. There was an opinion piece in Göteborgs-Posten by a woman called Kaisa Dovstad, and she recounts her experience of walking in a suburb in the evening, trying to find something to eat. And she only got, when she finally finds a store, it only has halal meat and small animals frozen and a lot of lentils and nothing to eat for her. But finally she finds a package of instant macaroni. And she uses this exemplum this exemplum story, this conversion story, as an example of what it means to have your own personal Jimmy moment. When you, who usually don't even think of voting an extreme right-wing party, you have the sense of maybe understanding where they are coming from. So that's the Jimmy moment. But she also says in her text that the question is not as black and white as this, but obviously on social media, it became very black and white. So this story of an epiphany or a Christian conversion was translated into a meme, the Jimmy moment, and it was highly polarized. So you only had two kinds of Jimmy moments in the Swedish media space. The one type of Jimmy moments were about your revelatory moment of realizing the bad consequences of immigration. And the other Jimmy moments were your revelatory experiences of structural racism in Sweden. So no gray area whatsoever, although the columnist herself tried to say that this is not black and white. The same person can be very positive toward immigration and then have her Jimmy moments. Obviously, that was a bit blunt and stupid, but it wasn't as black and white as the framings on social media. So I would say that this is a perfect case of social media storytelling because you have all the affordances at use. So shareability, scalability, and replicability, all of that. But the funny thing is that I've written about this with a medievalist scholar. So this is actually the type how the logic with which also medieval exemplar or classical exemplar were supposed to work. So you take the form of this, conversion or the moment of epiphany, and you repeat it. You try to repeat the formula given by a saint, usually. So in this case, I'm not sure whether it was Jimmy or the columnist who was the saint, but it was appropriated in the same manner as the exemplum in the Swedish media sphere, and it's still got the hashtag still lives on. So that's how social media storytelling usually works. So you have the highly prototypical story of a disruptive experience with highly relatable story world particulars. In this case, the macaroni and the frozen little animals and the lentils, all those little details that give you the story world as an immersive one. But what you end up with are only these small stories, gestures of framing and reframing, recontextualizing what people understand as the core of the story. So this is how small stories and narrative stance-taking and the experiential narrative prototype are related. They are the two sides of the same coin in a way. So I've been trying to, with my colleagues in my research teams, this is what I've been trying to describe with the concept of the viral exemplum. So what I've been trying to argue is that in today's narrative environments, the classics or the church or the Bible or any other fixed authority that was at the background when you had the exemplar of pre-modern or medieval or classical times is now replaced by the algorithmic emergent nature of authority. So it's the social media affordances that are the narrative authority of today. So any one of us can become Jesus or saint or the devil in 5 minutes on a global scale, because of this. We don't need to have any a priori authority to become the tellers of the example. And this definitely is related to the question of narrative acceptability. So I would say that the viral example is really the ultimate narrative function of the affordances of social media. And narrative context collapse is basically a result of the shareability, scalability, and replicability of experience. So that's why what we have been doing in my research projects is very much dependent on the first wave cognitive narratologists, such as Monica Fudenik, Meryl O'Ryan, David Herman, who identified experience or disruptive experience as a core feature of narrative and storytelling, and not temporal succession. So you don't even need temporal succession. You only need the temporal scope of having an epiphany. That's enough. So, and with a viral example, I've usually been connecting it to what we call the post-truth era. So the viral example is really the emblem of narrative post-truth, because on the first level, when you share something, as I said, it's never about sharing information, it's about sharing your experience. And that cannot be falsified. You cannot falsify another person's experience. You cannot falsify Kaisa Dovstad's experience of a Swedish suburb not being Swedish anymore, her not finding meatballs in the store. You cannot falsify that. It cannot be fact-checked. And then the second step, the story becomes representative. It's the me too of the Jimmy moment. I also have had my Jimmy moments. So it's replicable. The experience becomes replicable. You can always say that maybe just this case wasn't even true, but these things happen anyway. So it's representative. And this is how also cases where the original story has been falsified, you can still use it in the sense of the viral example. It can be about school bullying, for example, like in Finland. The case was falsified, but then again, people would go saying that, well, school bullying is a big issue anyway, and these things actually happen. And then the third step is normativity. So then you start saying that now we need to do something about this issue. So from unverified individual experience, you end up with drawing highly normative conclusions with a collective voice demanding change. And here is one of the examples that how fiction figures in the viral example. Who of you present here in the lecture room have read the Cat Person short story? Are you familiar with the case? US case. A couple of years ago, the New Yorker published a short story called Cat Person. And it's a story about a failed romance and bad sex, like bad date sex, basically. And the short story became extremely viral. Like it really took off within one weekend in the USA, and then next thing, probably in every other country in Europe, but not in France. Not a US thing. Not welcome here. So you have your own scandals, right? So maybe that's why you don't know about this. But in Finland, it was a big thing. So everybody was sharing Cat Person. We are very, very US-minded nation, I think. So, and the point was that actually this completely fictional, very Chehovian, rather mediocre short story was read as an opinion piece and a testimony and an accusation within the framework of the Me Too. So the headlines were saying, the depiction of uncomfortable romance in cat person seems to resonate with countless women, and so on. And the story lived on and on and on. And there were so many news pieces about it. And finally, it even turned out that the author had stolen the story from someone else's life. So that again gave it another twist. So very exhausting altogether. But here, this is from The Atlantic just after the viral case broke. This weekend, the story went unexpectedly viral, or perhaps in this Me Too moment, it went expectedly viral by revealing the lengths women go to in order to manage men's feelings and the shaming they often suffer nonetheless. A New Yorker spokesman said via email that of all the fiction the magazine published this year, Cat Person was the most read online, and it's also one of the most read pieces overall in 2017. So again, even fiction is read as an experience on social media. So it is framed as a personal experience, although it says fiction all over. It was in third person, imparfait, it was everything that fiction is. It was very Chekhovian, and it was so clear that the protagonist, the focalizing through whom the narration was focalized. I try to use Jeanette as he would like it to be used. So it was so clear that she was an unreliable filter. So it had all the Chekhovian elements, but it was in a way complex, or at least somehow literary piece, was read completely black and white, reread on social media. The ethical positioning within the story was all black and white. The guy was the villain, and the girl was the victim, and so on. But obviously, when you have a viral story that recounts this personal experience with some detail, you would usually hand a gun to the backlash, because every time you have some sort of particulars that you can pick up on, then you usually give the weapon to the backlash. So also in this case, the backlash, it was so easy to come up with the arguments against Cat Person as a Me Too piece, because actually the story is full of what we would nowadays call cat shaming. The guy in the short story is depicted as this ugly hairball, basically. Here's a short extract from the story. "Thank you for my presents," she said when they were back outside. Robert was wearing a rabbit fur hat that came down over his ears and a thick old-fashioned down jacket. She thought it was a good look for him, if a little dorky. The hat heightened his lumberjack aura, and the heavy coat hid his belly and the slightly sad slump of his shoulders. So this is the guy seen through the consciousness of the female protagonist. And of course, there was also a Twitter account set up with the title "Men React to Cat Person." And there's a collection of men's reactions to Cat Person, but it turned out that this is by a young female student who just wanted to highlight the fact that men are reacting reactively to the story. Yeah, but that was Cat Person, and to me it's one of the clearest examples of how social media reframes fiction. But there are also some a bit fussier cases. Yeah, this is, yeah, maybe this one, since I'm referring to the Me Too movement, yeah, through Springora and Cat Person. So one of the arguments that I've been making against the viral example in the connection of the Me Too movement is that whenever you rest your case on one individual experience, if you highlight one story, of abuse. And if you give it the shape of a prototypical experiential story, you usually invite the backlash. You invite the counter reading, because you have the story world particulars that you can easily falsify and debate, and then there's something rather fragile in a social media movement that rests on one individual case, because you have several validations, like this is it, this is how it goes, this is my experience too, and so on. But the one resting on one individual story as the core is always a bit sensitive. But what was the success of the Me Too movement to me was that most of the traffic was not just small stories, but minimal stories. So basically just sharing the hashtag Me Too, and the emphasis was on the word to and not me. So it was not about my story, but it was about the stance-taking, narrative stance-taking of just claiming the stance in a way. And that made it possible for the whole social media phenomenon to actually describe a structure, patriarchy, right. So millions and millions of stories that point toward the same structure. Whereas with the viral exemplum, you have one story at the middle that points to different directions. And here context collapse happens around this area. But with the Me Too movement, everything points to the structure, and context collapse doesn't hurt the case. But in this case, we can see how the individual story is vulnerable. Do you understand at all where I'm coming from? Thank you. Okay, so some arguments related to the to context collapse and the literary field. So I've been trying to explain how context collapse promotes the collision of genres. So for example, with the case of cat person, we can see how social media as the dominant narrative platform of today asserts even fiction. So decades ago, Bakhtin said that the novel can eat up all the other genres, right? So a novel can contain anything. But today, it's really the opposite. So in a way that it's usually like self-help discourse and social media can eat up anything. We can always read fiction as self-help or social media posts. We can always frame any narrative, be it journalistic or very complex story, be it fiction. The ultimate arena for reception is social media, and social media story logic reframes the ethos and the rhetoric of the narrative. And this, of course, many scholars would agree with me if I say that the dominance of autofiction obviously ties in. Here is highly related. So the social media affordances can affect even print literature. And I have a wonderful colleague in Helsinki, Matti Kangaskoski, who has written a very good article about how social media norms are imposed on contemporary literature. And he has Rupi Kaur as his example. Rupi Kaur is the most famous poet today, and her poetry looks pretty much like decoration texts on a wall or decoration text on your pillow. But they are ideal for social media storytelling. So the elements that Matti finds in Rupi Kaur and in social media are quick recognizability, brevity, clear affective stance, and high compression. So these are also pretty much the elements that we had in the babushka meme from the Ukrainian war. So these are the new ideals of storytelling. And I rather think that they are new. It wasn't always like that these would be the rhetorical ideals of any storytelling. But since now we have these dominant platforms of reception, even though you yourself might not have a social media account, whatever you produce will eventually be received on social media. You cannot control that, and that's part of the context collapse. You're exposed to the logic of social media as a writer, as a researcher, as an artist, as a journalist, even though you don't have your own account and are not interested at all on social media. You're still exposed. So in short, social media storytelling as a formal and interpretive dominant affecting the production and reception of literature. And one of the key elements is definitely the pervasiveness of personal storytelling. And again, this relates to the popularity of autofiction. And what Alexandra Kerkkakopoulou calls the directive for authenticity. So the fact that on social media, authenticity is capital. That usually reflects back on also literature and fiction. So people are looking for autobiographical elements or the author's authentic stance in fiction because of social media. So I definitely think that the existence of social media increases our interest in the intentions of an author, but not just intentions, but her ethos. So what we are looking for is the consistent ethos of the author across times and contexts. We want her to be consistent also in her fiction. And we want her to guarantee the value of the fiction through her own experience. And this is what happens in today's publishing houses. The publishers are pushing the authors forward to come out with their own personal story to market a fiction. You're probably familiar with this trend in marketing literature. There must be, of course, counter movements, and then we have authors like Welbeck that Baroni was talking about, I guess, a couple of weeks ago, or was last year in this seminar. So we have authors who manipulate their media publicity in many, many ways, but definitely not all. So it's very rare that an author can have a very artistic, manipulative, and complex relationship with the media. I wouldn't say that Elena Ferrante has a very complex relationship. For example, just remaining anonymous and then giving interviews isn't complex, right? But Welbeck is complex. Yeah. So all in all, I would say, and this relates to Rafael Baroni, his work, and also Lisbeth Cortals-Altes's work, that the unity of the work, what was formalists or new critics was the thing. The unity of the work itself is now being replaced by the unity of the author's ethos. That's what the audiences are looking for. And as a consequence, there is no outside story for a contemporary author. So I would say that the literary field is currently being reshaped by two intertwined forms of capital in the Bourdieusian sense. So it would be the digital capital and the narrative capital. Digital capital in the sense that how an author or a publisher or the audiences know to use social media for their benefit, or whether their life story is social media friendly, for example, if they can present themselves as a representative of a minority. That can be an asset, but it can also create a major drawback for an author who supposedly wants to write about universal things, and then she's always put into the section of minority author. So these kinds of ethos attributions are contributed and reinforced by social media platform logic and the social media affordances that are always in the lookout for your authentic personal story, and preferably it would have this story world disruption. So if you've had a severe illness, you've been school bullied, you have some sort of trauma, as an author, you are highly tellable, and that gives you the ethos around which you can build your whole career. So I have not been following Vanessa Springora's career, for example, after Le Consentement, but probably the positioning, the social media positioning of her being one of the faces of the French Me Too movement probably has some repercussions on how her career develops, because I do know that she will be publishing new novels. And I just want to mention that many of the ideas that I'm presenting here are part of a pending Academy of Finland application that I submitted with my colleagues. So here's a list of the names who have been contributing to the ideas. So I don't want to just say that it's all my thinking. So with these people, I've submitted the application called Authors of the Story Economy that will deal with these issues. So yet a couple of examples from the literary field. Olga Tokarczuk, Nobel laureate. Not sure whether you have come across this scandal, but Tokarczuk in Poland, she's actually a very debated personality, whereas in the international field, she's mostly just celebrated. But in Poland, where political polarization is extremely black and white at the moment, Tokarczuk has been accused of being extremely elitist. And no wonder, because, for example, in this interview, I will quote this. Polish writer Olga Tokarczuk, winner of the 2018 Nobel Prize in Literature, has stirred controversy after saying that she writes her books for intelligent people and that literature is not for idiots. I never expected everyone to read, and I never expected my books to end up being owned by every Tom, Dick, and Harry, said Tokarczuk during a literary festival, using the Polish term podstrechi, which literally translates as under attached roof, suggesting among the common people. I don't want them to end up being owned by every Tom, Dick, and Harry at all, she continued. Literature is not for idiots. In order to read books, you need to have a certain competence, a certain sensitivity, a certain understanding of culture. I don't believe that a reader will come along who knows absolutely nothing and will suddenly immerse themselves in some literature, added Tokarczuk. I write my books for intelligent people who think, who feel, who have some sensitivity. I believe that my readers are similar to me. To me, it seems that she's doing pretty much something that Welbeck is doing, but from a different political camp, although I don't think that Welbeck has a political camp, but Tokarczuk has. She's an animal rights activist, she's a feminist, and so on. So very much left-wing liberal author, but still making these highly elitist comments. And to me, it seems that it's part of a very sophisticated public strategy. And then there's activist, leftist activist and journalist Maya Stasko, she has written this on Twitter. Tokarczuk doesn't want her books to end up being owned by every Tom, Dick, and Harry because she doesn't write for idiots. This is an approach to people that has always frustrated me. Under thatched roofs live people who don't think or feel. not only is that untrue, it's also deeply contemptuous. The literary community has been submerged in classicism for years with their sense of superiority, I guess, misunderstanding and self-indulgence. Their contempt for the people compensates for their, I think it's small earnings in literature. So this was pretty much the response to Tokarczuk's professed ethos in the interview. But the interesting thing that we as literary scholars can do, of course, is cross-reading the ethos that is built within the fiction and the ethos that the author gives away in her public performances. So I would definitely compare this interview with Tokarczuk's just a wonderful novel being translated in English as Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead. In this novel, the protagonist is, she's this crazy, the prototype of a crazy elderly woman who, it turns out, I will spoil the novel for you now, turns out that she's a murderer. So she has systematically murdered men who hunt animals. And she believes in horoscopes, but she's at the same time extremely intelligent, highly literary, and highly elitist. And she would usually give away very radical opinions about other people that pretty much resemble those by Tokarczuk, but Tokarczuk is not a murderer, but her alter ego in the novel is actually a murderer. So she would really like to get rid of many men in this world. So here are some excerpts from this wonderful novel. So and she's also a very classical type of Boothian, Thelanian, unreliable narrator, but at the same time reliable if you compare her to Tokarczuk's interviews. So unreliable in the Boothian, Thelanian sense, where you try to, within the work itself, you try to figure out whether there is another system of knowledge and morals beneath the narration of the narrator. In that sense, the protagonist is unreliable in the old terms of rhetorical narrative theory. But if you look at the transmedial authorial ethos of Tokarczuk, suddenly the narrator actually becomes reliable in the sense that you get the feeling that Tokarczuk would also like to, if not murder, then some other way get rid of stupid men who murder animals just because they're stupid. So here excerpts from the novel. On the other hand, I felt great relief. Sometimes when one thinks more broadly, ignoring one's usual mental preferences, probably, for example, like empathy, and considers instead the sum total of persons' deeds, one might conclude that their life is not a good thing for others. I think anyone would say that I'm right about this. So actually, I would say that Tokarczuk probably, if we look at her transmedial authorial ethos, she would agree with the sentence saying one might conclude that their life is not a good thing for others. But she's not serious as author when she says that I think anyone would say that I'm right about this. Not, of course, not anyone. So this is the signal, this is the classical signal of we now having an unreliable narrator within the fiction. But if we look at the bigger cultural literary field and Tokarczuk's position within that literary field, part of it is not unreliable. And another quote. He must have been accustomed to giving orders. Now she's watching a policeman scolding her. So he must have been accustomed to giving orders and being obeyed and was easily carried away by anger, a Jovian personality. I could also tell that he didn't understand everything I was saying. Firstly, for the obvious reason that I was using arguments alien to him, but also because he had a limited vocabulary. And that was the type of person who despises anything he can't understand. So this would be the Dick, Tom, and Harry of Tokarczuk. He poses a threat to many creatures, human and animal. I concluded my complaint about Bigfoot, in which I had described observations and suspicions. So Bigfoot is the first man to die, not by her hand, but by, she actually interprets the murder to have been committed by forest animals. And then she repeats that formula, becomes the murderer herself. Yeah, but I highly recommend the novel. It's complex, it's beautiful, it's sophisticated, and never mind the elitism. And then another case from Finland, not as interesting, of course, as Tokarczuk, but we had a debut novelist called Ossi Nyman, who was immensely successful with social media precisely because he was able to generate a backlash. And this is also a wonderful example of the context collapse happening within the literary sphere. So even before the novel was published, he gave a personal interview to our main newspaper, Helsingin Sanomat, where he announced that he's an ideologically unemployed person. So he chooses not to work for ideological reasons. And obviously this went highly viral because we are an awfully moralistic nation and our core value is work in Finland. Not success, never success. That holds me down. It's all just work, no success. So the novel is called Arrogance, Röyhkeys. And it's an autofictional novel where we have a character like him, and the things happening to him resemble the things happening to Ossi Nyman. But when this fictional Ossi Nyman enters a writing school, where actually my husband nowadays teaches, a writing school in Helsinki, the novel gets extremely complicated. So the first half is extremely simple, like written by an unemployed person. And then the second half is highly complex because it's written by a guy who is now in a writer's school. And I think it's a wonderful novel. And it's highly complex because of the simplicity-complexity combination. But also the marketing thing was so extremely successful that he was able to make other people position themselves in relation to him. So either you were supporting this unemployed, ideological unemployed, or you were objecting him. He was referred to in our parliamentary talk many times that we have these Ossis, so he became a viral example. But the sad thing was that pretty much nobody read the novel, but the novel is wonderful. And there's this one scene, for example, before the guy enters the writing school. He's a big fan of Bruce Springsteen, a guy who sings about the working class, right? A big fan of Springsteen, and he queues to the concert. And since he's an unemployed guy, he can be there really early. So he will be on the first row, while the workers will be at the back because they don't have time to queue to the best places. Already this is wonderful, I think. But then he is so idly sitting in the grass and waiting for the concert to start that he dreams of actually talking to Springsteen. And then there's this wonderful discussion between the guys. Finally, I asked if he felt guilty of never really having had a proper job, and having refused all work already when he was young, just wanting to make a living in music, as if he considered himself too good to have an ordinary job. So whether Springsteen is also an ideologically employed or not, unemployed or not. Yet he sang almost solely about working people and everyday heroism. And then Springsteen goes, yeah, he said, finally, there's a conflict. And this, I think this is the author's commentary. He already knew what was coming, right? He already knew what was coming with the marketing, with the political polarization, and then he already knew how to plant the seeds of complexity within the fictional work, but people wouldn't find them. Only the literary scholars would find the seeds of complexity and some rare readers. But the point is that the narrative discourse of the novel is already responding to the social media responses or social media reception of the novel. And this is something that I've been studying lately, how contemporary fiction always already somehow incorporates social media logic into the discourse. And this is one of the key examples of that. I'm not sure whether that happens with Tokarczuk, but I have other experience examples, and I'm not sure whether it would be correct to say that Vanessa Springora's memoir has been written with social media on mind. But we must understand that it was always already framed by the Me Too movement. And when people receive the novel, they receive it as a social media post. So they are not criticizing the rhetoric, they are not criticizing the style, they are not criticizing the structure. They just share the experience or reject the experience. But in Springora's case, I guess it was overwhelmingly positive in terms of the reception. And this is a figure where I try to map the elements of what I call the transmedial authorial ethos. So the idea that contemporary literary field is dominated by the idea of the transmedial authorial ethos of the fiction writer. So in the transmedial bubble, we have certain elements. So for example, the idea of author as a franchise. So if we consider fiction author as a franchise, the novel or the poetry collection is really one product among others. So the franchise is oftentimes the personal story of the author, and the fictional novel is really part of the franchise and not a special case. It can even be a reprint of blog writings or one's social media profile. Or it can be a recording with your psychiatrist or therapist. So that's only part of the franchise. And context collapse definitely giving shape to the literary phenomena. And the fact that telling also within fiction is easily considered as affective political positioning. So it's very difficult to be Welbeck. He manages it, as we've seen. He's won many prizes in France, but it's not possible for everybody. There are some elements in Welbeck that make him the special case. And social media narrative affordances change the rhetoric and ethics of fiction. For example, making authenticity narrative capital. So that is part of the explanation behind the popularity of autofiction or any literary work that has an autobiographical element. So the authentic story of the author. And then when we think about the concept of narrative authority, in that bubble we have experientiality. So we want the experience of the author, at least in marketing, and we often project it to the fiction. And we also seek authors who are exemplary, for example, as minority authors, Me Too authors, enfant terrible authors. So exemplarity is good because it's shareable, it's scalable, it's the things that social media wants it to be. Narrative forms of knowing, for example, the nomic is related to how universal truths travel on social media. And this is related to Raphael's case of Welbeck. His new book is about the polyphony in receiving Welbeck's work. But we could also ask from the perspective of social media affordances whether polyphony, or what I have been calling vocal indecision, for example, in free literary discourse, whether that is being made less and less possible in fiction, because it creates, for example, context collapse might make free indirect discourse a bit more difficult, because context collapse is all about taking screenshots from novels. So this could have happened to Flaubert and Emma, that we have a screenshot of the character's free indirect discourse that looks like authorial report, and that goes to social media. So context collapse happening there, pretty much like in the Madame Bovary trial. but in the trial, it was shown that this is free indirect discourse. Free indirect discourse was invented theoretically, but in context collapse situations, free indirect discourse, it doesn't survive that well. And then the fact that the implied author is constructed within the public sphere. So Tokarczuk would be a prime example of this. So when we read the novel, we can definitely tell that the protagonist is an unreliable narrator, and it's easy to build the implied message or the implied signs of her insanity and so on within the literary work. But since the implied author is pretty much nowadays constructed collectively on social media in an emergent way, then we cannot rely on the old markers of unreliability anymore as constructed by the rhetorical narrative theorists, or at least we need to somehow modify the concepts so that they can cover the what I call the transmedial authorial ethos. And also fan fiction and fan communities are very important here. So for example, with J.K. Rowling, when we talk about the acceptability of narratives. So this is pretty much what happens. So the public sphere usurps the fictions and makes them their own, and can even seclude the author from the literary sphere because she's cancelled, but we love the books, so they are ours now, and we construct a new implied author that we like. And we don't want you. Yeah. And then finally, the bubble ethos. So, and here I draw from Lisbeth's work on the unadopted subjectivity and ethos effects. That's pretty much related to what I've been working on with free indirect discourse and nomic statements. So in the times of Bachtin's idea of the novel being able to eat up anything, and the novel possibly being polyphonic, you could have all kinds of ethos expressions that were just lingering there. It was not necessary to attach a certain ethos to a certain agent. But our social media age forces us somehow to attach ethos to an individual, because it's also a social risk for us. If we are not sure about the ethos of Welbeck, is it safe for us to share his post or share a passage from his novel? So any kind of polyphony or unattached ethos effects is a social risk for the audiences and a social risk for all the actors within the literary field. It's a risk for publishing houses that can be cancelled in 5 minutes and all the authors gone because there was a unattached ethos effect in one novel. This is theoretical possibility, but it can happen. And we also need to rethink the idea of the ethos. So in an Aristotelian sense, ethos is part of the persuasion process of the orator. But in social media, and within the contemporary literary sphere, ethos is pretty much attributed, and it's not built by the narrator. And this is precisely because of the context collapse. Your story is not yours. Your content is not yours. And of course, this has always been the case with literature. Your novel is not yours, right? And the author is dead and whatever. So we are but yeah, this is a center established in the honor of Barth. So that's definitely true. So fiction has always been a free bird, and the reader has always been the master. But in the social media environments, this is exponential, and it's a process that escalates usually. So it's not the same as the author being dead. So where and by whom is consistency, for example, for the ethos of J.K. Rowling constructive? That's something that we need to ask. And finally, I also think that many of these impulses relate to the discussion about metamodernism and new sincerity. You can just reject those concepts. You don't need to like those concepts at all. They are debatable. But many of the features that those scholars are discussing are pretty much related to the social media affordances that are now affecting the literary field. For example, the authenticity being capital. And the many forms of irony and rejecting irony have a lot to do with the binary logic of social media, of not liking and liking and so. So finally, I'd like to argue that the 21st century storytelling convergence alters the parameters for the acceptability of narratives. So narrative accountability in viral storytelling environments, we are narratively accountable for what we do and what we say and what we have done 20 years ago or what we have said 20 years ago. And context collapse results in genre collapse oftentimes. So a very Chekhovian short story becomes an opinion piece about Me Too without any intention from the author herself, just through reframing, sharing, and the context collapsing. And transmedial storytelling ethos becomes the key, not only for the regular social media user, but also for authors, fiction authors. And what we see at work in the storytelling convergence is experientiality, representativeness, and normativity intertwined. And my concept of viral example, the viral exemplum tries to describe this story logic. And one a bit more philosophical aspect to it is that in terms of ethics, emphasis is put on the ethics of individual encounters. So how a person, his acceptability is valued or judged often depends on very small scale events, and this oftentimes clouds and obscures the fact that the problems that we are dealing with, racism, misogynism, sexual violence, and so on, they are structural. So that's why social media activists need to look for the next Me Too. For example, what would be the Me Too of climate change? Because climate change is a complex structural issue, just as patriarchy is. So we need to look at social media strategies that somehow reflect the complexity of the issue. So it's not about one villain or one perpetrator and one victim, but a structural issue. So how to point to that structure and not to the saints and the devils on an individual level. And all in all, in terms of the acceptability of narratives, these are the types of logic that definitely increase political polarization. So this was all a bit negative, I'm sorry. Yeah, so thank you.